If you have a message which says you have to fight if you're a Muslim, subjugate all these people, you have to fight. If you don't, you're not a real Muslim, and if you die while you're fighting, you'll go to heaven. If those are the final marching orders given to you by your prophet, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to fight. And this is why within 150 years of Muhammad's death, 1/3 of the known world was conquered by Muslims. We need to get that image into our heads. 1/3 of the known world, from the shores of the Atlantic all the way to the valleys of India, both sides of the Mediterranean, conquered. Because the message was one that launched Muslims into an undelimited warfare. Of course, people did get tired of fighting after a while. After about a few hundred years, there was a new allowance for Muslims to stop fighting, and that was that polytheists could also pay the jizya. So by the time Sharia law became codified, it wasn't codified during Muhammad's life, it was codified by great jurists, the great classical jurists a few hundred years later. By the time it was codified, Muslims could get not only Jews and Christians, but also polytheists to pay tribute if they didn't want to be fought. And that is how ultimately the battles, the fronts, stopped expanding outwards. And it wasn't until the fall of the Ottoman Empire after World War I that a lot of this power was diminished. Well over 1,000 years of Islamic power that came from these core teachings. Now, why does all this matter? Let's bring this all back. Today, when Muslims learn Islam, and I'm not pointing the finger at Muslims for this, this is true of everyone. When Muslims learn Islam, they generally absorb it from their surroundings, from their parents, from their teachers, from the mosque. They absorb it. Christians do that, Jews do that. That's how we learn our religion. Centuries of tradition have built up a variety of schools of Islamic thought. So you've got, for example, the 4 traditional schools of Islamic thought: Shafi, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi. And then you've got the Shia school, which is branched off. You've got the 12er, the 7er, etc. So you've got all these various expressions of Islamic thought. It's not monolithic, and these people all have different views of what the Quran and the Hadith mean. So when people are learning about Islam, they're not going directly to the Quran, usually. They're not going directly to the Quran and the Hadith to learn about Islam. They're absorbing it from others. That's exactly what I did, and that's exactly why I said Islam's a religion of peace. It's exactly why I said Muhammad only fought defensive wars. That's exactly why I said the terrorists have nothing to do with Islam. But when you start studying the texts themselves, when you start looking at the Quran and you start looking at the Hadith, you start looking at the Sirah literature, whether it be Sirah Maghazi or what have you, you will find violence woven into the very traditions of Islam. The core traditions, not peripheral traditions, the Quran and the Hadith, foundational pillars of Sharia. Now, what is happening today? Why are people getting radicalized in various pockets around the world? Why are people leaving Canada to go fight for ISIS? Why are people leaving America to go fight for ISIS? Right now, at the most conservative count, we have over 5,000 non-Middle Easterners fighting for ISIS. There are more British citizens who are Muslims fighting for ISIS than fighting for the British. Why? How do we explain this? Are they all stupid? Are they all demonic? No, let's not demonize people like that. Let's try to understand their reasoning. Every single one of them gives you their reasoning very clearly. I remember when these 3 Bethnal Green girls, Bethnal Green's a city in England, who were at the top of their class. They were the most popular girls. They wore their hijabs. You can still see their Twitter accounts, by the way. They were very devout in their Islamic faith. They told their parents that they were going out for an outing. They managed to escape to Syria through Turkey. Their parents couldn't understand what happened. Their parents didn't, of course, didn't support terrorism. They said, what happened to our daughters? Now, the media, of course, it tends to lean on the compassionate side. It tends to, not always. And so they're willing to say, oh, those girls were brainwashed. They were brainwashed by recruiters. They went from being the smartest girls in their class to complete zombies, and they just were brainwashed. That's not what the girls say. The girls said to their parents, Mom, Dad, if only you knew what Islam actually teaches, then you would understand. How can they say that? Girls are at the top of their class. What did Osama bin Laden say in 1999, before the Twin Towers were attacked, when he was having an interview with an ABC reporter? He said, "Be ready, we're coming for America. We're going to bring down those towers for no other reason than for the defense of Islam." How does that work? What's the connection? Is he just an idiot? No. How does it work? Let's actually address how it works. In the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire fell. The last caliph of Islam, and he was mostly a figurehead by that point, but the last caliph of Islam was dismissed. And Muslims began to ask themselves, what went wrong? What went wrong? We used to have power in a third of the world. What happened? The answer that was given, by the way, again, not pointing the finger at Muslims. A lot of people do this. I don't know if you know much about Jewish history, but Jews until 70 AD had a temple system where pretty much the whole Judaic faith revolved around sacrifices and ceremonies at the temple. It fell twice. But both times that it fell, the Jews asked themselves, what have we done wrong? What did we do wrong? Where did it go wrong? The response that they came up with was the same response that the Muslims came up with. We have stopped following God. We have stopped following God. We need to return to a direct following of God's word. So Jews did that, of course. We saw that, and we ultimately saw the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD as a result of that. Muslims, what did they start doing? They started thinking, why are things going wrong? Well, in the West, Muslims are pandering to capitalism. In the East, Muslims are pandering to communism. Where is Sharia being followed? If we just follow Sharia, Allah will send His blessings upon us, and once again, we will rise to power. Who is the main intellectual mind behind this? There's a man named Sayyid Qutb was one, and he actually followed on the heels of Hassan al-Banna, who did what? He was the founder of an organization that we know called the Muslim Brotherhood. Why did he start the Muslim Brotherhood? He had two very explicit reasons why he wanted to start the Muslim Brotherhood. Because we want to follow the Quran and we want to follow the Hadith. This is what we need to do in order to receive Allah's favor. That was the reason why the Muslim Brotherhood was started. And Sayyid Qutb followed along that. He fueled the Muslim Brotherhood with his intellectual musings. And he was what I call the father of the Islamic Reformation. Long story short, we could be here forever. Sorry. Okay, yeah, I got to wrap it up. Sorry. So, Sayyid Qutb then launches this train of thought that we need to return Islam to power. We need to return Muslims into power, into the global scene by being devout Muslims. What happened to him? The Egyptian government imprisoned him on false charges because they thought he was being too radical, and they ultimately executed him on false charges. They made a martyr out of him. They made him into a hero. And when people saw how the government reacted, they said, look, this is verification that the governments are selling out to Westerners. We really need an Islamic government. And this is how Egypt has moved from a more secular to a more Islamic government over the past 70 years, at least until the Arab Spring started. Now, who was Sayyid Qutb's brother? Osama bin Laden's professor. And so a lot of those teachings filter down to Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden starts Al-Qaeda. Good job, America. We gave him tens of millions of dollars during the war with Afghanistan, and using that money, he started Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda had a branch that went out to Syria and to Iraq. They ultimately had a falling out. It was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. They had a falling out with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, so they decided to call themselves ISIS. It all traces back to this same ideology, that we need to restore the glory of Islam. Which is why, by the way, ISIS's name, the Islamic State, what they're trying to do is they're trying to return, are you with me? They're trying to restore this Islamic State by currying Allah's favor. Boko Haram does not call itself Boko Haram. That's a denigration of words that mean Western education is haram, it's forbidden. What they actually call themselves are those who propagate the teachings of Muhammad. That's their Arabic name for themselves. Or at least it was until last February, which is when they became the East African branch of ISIS. And they submitted to ISIS. Why? The founder of Boko Haram said, and he was martyred too, which is why they gained so much popularity as well. He said that if you're going to follow some people, two of them that I think you should follow are Osama bin Laden and Sayyid Qutb. Look, what's going on is around the Islamic world, you have people who are going back to the Quran and the Hadith. They're skipping tons of generations of tradition from these various schools of Islamic thought. They're skipping past it, going right back to the Quran and the Hadith, and they're just reading it from the source and saying, this is what we need to do. End of story. We need to go back. That's how we're going to restore Allah's favor. So forget the way you practice Islam. That's why they're willing to kill other Muslims, because they're saying, you're not really Muslim. You're a kafir. And when they do that, they use a process in Islamic theology called takfir, to call other Muslims kafir. They're actually following Sharia in doing this. And then they say, okay, forget you guys, we are going to practice Islam the way it ought to be practiced, and Allah will give us favor. And that's why you ask questions like, why the heck is ISIS doing what it's doing? There's no way ISIS can win this. There's no way. It's angered the whole world. Even Japan. It's hard to anger Japan, but they anger Japan. How do you do this? Well, the reason why is because they don't care what you think, and they don't really care if they live or not, because they believe Allah will come to their rescue. And they say so. I'm not making this up. If you want to read any of ISIS's propaganda, just go online and type in the name for their magazine. It's called Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q. The Clarion Project is a Christian, or I'm not sure if they're Christian, but they're definitely not a Muslim organization, that puts all of their magazines online for this purpose, so we can understand who these people are instead of just demonizing them. Every magazine that ISIS has put up, and by the way, they're nice as far as glossy, 2-page spreads, really good grammar and diction. They're professionally trained Westerners who have higher degrees of education, who have a good amount of money, who've gone to fight for ISIS. These aren't idiots. And they say time and again what their reasoning is. They're quoting Muhammad, they're quoting the Hadith. They're saying to prospective recruits, do you want to follow Muhammad because this is what he taught? Do you want to follow the Quran because this is what it taught? You have to come and fight for us. Some of these atrocities that we've seen that boggle our minds, right? These girls in Chibok, they were just studying. They were just girls in school. They were all kidnapped, and they were sold, some of them as cheap as $14 a girl, into sex slavery. How? Why? Why could this happen? Because in the Hadith, there are accounts of Muhammad and his troops capturing women and dividing them up as slaves. And they point to those Hadith. They say Muhammad did it. They're taking these women as sex slaves, as concubines. You can only marry 4 wives in Islam, so you can marry 4, but you can have as many concubines as you want. And there are Muslim scholars who have written a response to ISIS, and I applaud their effort. There's hundreds of Muslim scholars who've gathered together and written a response to ISIS saying, what you're doing is not Islamic. You want to know why? Because we wrote an agreement 100 years ago saying that we no longer do this. In other words, they're trying to rebuke ISIS by saying that a modern consensus prohibits sex slavery. ISIS is going to laugh in their face, saying, who cares about your modern consensus? This is why Allah is judging you. We're going to follow Muhammad. We're going to follow the Hadith. And that's exactly what they do. And that's exactly why we see what they see. Why is it that they are willing to, just the other day when they conquered, no, I say just the other day, but it was probably a few months ago by now, when they conquered a new territory in Syria, that they made all the boys drop their pants. If you were a teenage boy, they told you to drop your pants. And if you had pubic hair, they would behead you. Why? Because that's exactly what Muhammad did when he conquered the Banu Qurayza, or I wouldn't say conquered, but when he was judging the Banu Qurayza, that was exactly the judgment that he went with. We need to understand what's happening. ISIS is pointing people, and not just ISIS, but all these people who are being radicalized are doing what they're doing because they're going directly to the Quran and to the Hadith. This stuff is in there. And the more we keep blinding our eyes and saying, no, it's not in there, the more we're going to see people being radicalized because we're not addressing the problem. You can't cure a disease unless it's properly diagnosed.